Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Sorry. Okay, so my name's Maurice. I'm a veterinarian and associate professor at UC Davis, and I focus on poultry health and food safety epidemiology. Um, One of the things that is challenging about integrative or pastured production is biosecurity, and as Anne likes to say, biosecurity is just a fancy word for how do we keep these birds healthy from diseases where the main reservoir of the disease is wildlife. So today I'm gonna you can talk about biosecurity for hours and hours and hours, but I kind of want to just go over a very practical example of, at least in my mind, a practical example of how these systems are just challenging. It doesn't make them good or bad. It just means that it's when you're in this kind of environment, separating out domesticated animals from wildlife is a challenge. And ultimately, my own philosophical approach is don't make perfect the enemy of good. Good is the best you can do. Then that's better than mediocre. And there is no such thing as perfect biosecurity, no matter what you do. I mean, if you're on a space station, you wouldn't have perfect biosecurity. So, and here you can see kind of our effort at biosecurity in a sense, where we've got some students talking to a farmer back here, and they're wearing Tyvek suits and hairnets and booties or rubber boots. You don't have to do all this. You just have to follow the philosophical approach, which is basically, you want to make sure that the clothes that you're wearing had no exposure to other animals, especially wildlife, but other domestic animals too. So if you were at a feed store picking up some feed, wearing the same shoes at the feed store that you're going to wear on a farm is really kind of playing with fire. You can see here, we built this mobile coop several years ago, and we've got these part of it's curtain sided, so we can control ventilation and temperature on the inside, which is wonderful. One of the challenges, though, some viruses, for example, can be aerosolized and carried in the wind. So to that point, nothing's perfect, right? We all have trade-offs. And one of the things we had to consider is how to create good ventilation while also reducing the risk of disease transmission, because there's habitat, for example, around this farm. I think those are the main things I'm going to focus on. You don't need all of this, I think, is one of the main lessons that I've learned. I think Anne will probably off the record tell you that sometimes I'm a little impractical, and sometimes I'm talking from that kind of academic high horse. And I've learned over the years that, like, what, you've got a pair of jeans and some shoes that are dedicated to your pasture, that's perfect, right? You're following the philosophy. So and in fact, culturally, pastured producers don't really like when you come on their farm like this. It's almost insulting to them in a certain sense, and the last thing I ever want to do is insult anyone. So as long as I'm following the philosophy, then I am 100% in favor of an old pair of jeans and some dedicated shoes, because that does 100% what I want it to do. You can see around here, good fences make good neighbors. So we have kind of two types of fences that we'll talk about. But, I think people focus on so many of the fancy things when it comes to biosecurity and all these other things, and we don't focus on the real simple things. And fencing is so fundamental, so essential. It's not perfect, but good fencing will take you, 90% of where you need to be. If you can have good fencing, that is so important. So we'll talk about some other things you can do too, but fencing and walking a fence line to make sure that wildlife aren't digging underneath it. If I walk a fence line and I see a hole, not from wildlife, but just a hole, I promise you there are a gazillion and one animals way smarter than me that are predatory or non-predatory and carrying diseases that will find that hole before I ever find that hole. So gaps they see the same things that we do, and in fact, they probably sense it better for obvious reasons. I'm very informal by nature, so we all know each other now. So feel free to email, call, all those good things as we continue to work together during this USDA grant. This is just our first talk. We're supposed to have, I think, 7 or 8 of these a year. So your suggestions are always appreciated. So because there's been a lot of attention with respect to highly pathogenic avian influenza, I'm going to kind of use that as a case study. I'm from California, but unfortunately, highly pathogenic avian influenza is everywhere in North America. We've had a little lull lately, which is wonderful, but it is still ubiquitous in the environment. And waterfowl, ducks and geese, are the primary reservoir. In California, I love when reporters ask me, are we going to have highly pathogenic avian influenza next fall? And I always say yes. And they're like, well, how do you know that? And I'm like, well, the low pathogen, they asked if we're going to get avian influenza next fall. And the reality is that we have endemic strains. And some of these highly pathogenic strains, unfortunately, are off the record. They're endemic. USDA and our trading partners don't want to hear that, but it's in so many different species of animals at this point. It's hard to imagine that it would just disappear. But, and you can just see, so we have a lot of virus out there, and waterfowl like water. So if you have ponds, or if you have places where waterfowl like to eat, cornfields, rice fields, anything like that near you, then you have waterfowl that are probably close by. And they're migratory, so the seasonality of waterfowl changes. And to that point, I just want to show you something that we made a couple of years ago. I don't know if you guys are familiar with eBird, but eBird is a great resource through the Cornell University. And you can take waterfowl maps. And what we've done is scrape all this waterfowl data off of eBird and made these maps. So just pick your favorite part of the country, and I'm just going to scroll through these maps just for a few months, just so you can kind of sort of see that even though your farm doesn't change location, the waterfowl load around your farm definitely does change, and there's a seasonality component to that. And that's seasonality is based on temperature and what resources are available and stuff like that. So I'm just going to scroll through that. The kind of hotter colors reflect where we have more waterfowl. And the California Central Valley is like off the charts. So if you do your poultry in the Central Valley or anywhere near there, you're kind of, unfortunately, that's where we have this, kind of challenge of how do we grow food and also support ecosystem waterfowl habitat in a sustainable way. It's a real challenge. So I'm just going to scroll through this, and you can kind of just pick your spots that you want to look at and just see how over the weeks waterfowl are moving down into North America. It's nice and warm. This is what happens in the fall. California, we have a order of magnitude more waterfowl. You can see these are a bunch of rice fields up here. Along the Mississippi Valley, you can see that's a real hot spot too, the Delmarva Peninsula. But even this whole area here is a real hot spot, which I had not appreciated until we made these maps. But you can start seeing how now they're moving back up north again, because they in June and July is when they or June, July, and August when they start doing breeding. We'll have all kinds of cute ducklings and goslings in a few months, and you can just sort of see how that works. Now, if we look at that on a micro level, here's a duck that's been telemetrized. It's got a little cell phone on it, and here's a commercial poultry farm, and you can see how that duck basically zigzags over the farm. Why is it spending so much time there? Because it wants access to feed and water. The birds have their best resources, their best sense is sight, so they can see a lot. This is why, whether you're a conventional poultry farmer or a pastured poultry farmer, why it's so important to think about biosecurity. You want to make it as unappetizing or uninteresting as possible. I mean, this bird made a beeline for this facility because it can see, and it probably has some kind of memory. They're not stupid. And it probably knows there's some good feed around there. So when we think about how disease gets transmitted, a bunch of gazillion and one different ways. And on the outside, you're kind of seeing these kind of, well, on the outside, you're seeing these kind of physical locations or different breeds, excuse me, or different genres of poultry. And on the inside, you're seeing, some of these where these different people might interact with each other. So you might say, I never interact with anyone that does anything with fighting birds, but the reality is they have to get feed too. If you're a small producer, you have to get feed from feed source too. You might not be able to go to a feed mill. So that interaction is how disease gets spread, and we take it for granted. And people will say, well, I've been fine all these years, and that's true. And it's usually a relatively anomalous event that will cause, it's like, how many times are you going to roll dice before you get snake eyes? And when that interaction happens, that's how viruses get spread from location to location. And this is that same location that I showed you just outside on that first slide on our kind of UC Davis Pastured Poultry farm here. This is just a side view of that coop, and all kinds of wildlife that we took pictures with GoPro cameras and just by ourselves. And it's a real challenge, as you guys know. That doesn't make it worse or better. It just means that that's one of the challenges of this type of system. We're going to spend the rest of the talk basically talking about how to reduce that. So just pointing out, there's a lot of diseases. We'll talk about that another time. There's a lot of different diseases we can talk about. Highly pathogenic avian influenza is a viral disease. These are just like an example of what the diagnostic lab at UC Davis, what they see every year typically. And they see a lot of different diseases. Highly pathogenic avian influenza is just one of them. That's a bad one. There's two kind of Ebola-like viruses in chickens, virulent Newcastle disease and highly pathogenic avian influenza. And we've got both of them in spades in California, unfortunately. But the Newcastle disease is kind of mainly in Southern California, but the highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPATH-AI, is everywhere. This is, I'm not going to go over every aspect of this, but I did want to kind of, some people have smaller systems. So in a pastured system, putting a roof on the area where the birds are kind of in their run, not practical, right? But I did want to kind of point out that everyone has different type of systems, and some people have relatively small systems. And here's someone that sold their eggs. I took some photographs of it, and I kind of put it under the umbrella of backyard biosecurity. But there's some overlap here, and a couple things I kind of wanted to point out. Again, this person's fencing was amazing. They don't use chicken wire. Chicken wire, I wish they would name it something else, because chicken wire doesn't really prevent. It's probably the weakest type of fencing you can get. There's something called hardware cloth, and hardware cloth is brutal to work with. It'll scratch you up, but the 1/4-inch hardware cloth is really strong, and using a staple gun, you can have that stuff really kind of rolled out really nicely and attached to these 2x4s. So that hardware cloth, if you're going to remember one thing about fencing, I would really focus on using hardware cloth and make sure you get some heavy gloves and some long sleeve shirts so you don't scratch yourself up too badly. And then other things like tree trimming. We live in a part of California, it gets really hot in the summer. So shade is so important, but you don't have to have the branches, right next to the rooftops, because that's how rodents get into coops and things like that. And then they'll start eating food and transmitting disease at the same time. Making sure water and feed are clean. That is so also essential. Spilled feed is the biggest magnet possible, right? If I'm a rodent or any kind of other bird, a songbird, those birds can transmit all the same diseases that waterfowl do. They just don't get the same kind of negative attention, and they do end up in barns and things like that because they're just around a little more often. They can transmit disease. So think about the biggest thing that I would suggest is big picture cleaning up feed and good fencing are the two biggies. We can talk a little more about some of these other things, and this is what's called a tin cat, which I'll show you in a little. And having things like sick pens for birds that are sick, so you can separate them out. So hopefully you can stop disease transmission within your flock. Those type of things are really fundamental to having the healthiest flock possible. So just going over like how, what do we do? So a couple things I would point out, especially, focusing on waterfowl and or predators in general, is there is no silver bullet. So if you ever see, I get a little chuckle when you see some of the waterfowl mitigation tools, and they seem to kind of think that, this widget or this laser or this water cannon or this sonic blaster type thing is going to get rid of all waterfowl. It's just not true. It's kind of a cat and mouse game, and waterfowl are smart, just like all wildlife are, or else they wouldn't be surviving. So you just have to think about this as logically as possible. So we'll get to some examples in a second. And then, this kind of sad reality about poultry diseases, that they're not most of them, especially when infectious diseases, for the most part, you're not going to get, this eureka moment of like, I'm going to give them, apple cider vinegar, and that's going to cure, 1,000,001 different diseases. It just doesn't work that way, unfortunately. And the same thing with antibiotics, if that was the direction you were going to go into. There are some treatments, and we can talk about that at a different point. There are some treatments for certain diseases, like coccidia, some bacteria, but for the most part, it's not economically efficacious, and the results, just from a health perspective, aren't birds will get better, as I tell you in vet school. Treat the animal fast so you can take credit when they get better. But a lot of animals will ultimately recover on their own, but you'll have some mortality and some morbidity, some sickness in there. And when birds are sick, they're not going to be producing eggs and meat at the levels that you want them to be. So it's in our best interest to really focus on biosecurity as opposed to treatment, is kind of what I'm trying to say. So I showed that. So feed is a magnet. So, a couple things that I would point out here. So if you look at this feed here, these are pellets. Pelletized feed, as opposed to a crumble, is a little more expensive. But for pastured systems, I like pelletized feed a little better because it's easier to clean up. The crumble spills more, and it spreads all over the ground, and it's a little harder to clean up. And now you're going to start having, kind of that magnet scenario. There's all kinds of, whoa, is that mine or, sorry, I don't know. Oh, sorry, that was my ESPN. Did people hear that? Sorry, my apologies. Give me a minute. So from current slide. Okay. Sorry about that. These pelletized feeds are more ideal when it comes to kind of a pastured system. There's all kinds of different feeding systems, but just in general, I like pelletized feeds more. Trash cans are really good kind of ways to prevent disease transmission. Because if you use a bungee cord and you secure that trash can lid, it's very difficult for anything to get in there. And having these type of scenarios is very common. Not only do they eat your feed, any kind of wildlife, but they will also poop in there, and that's a great way to spread disease. Just make sure when you're using these that you're, if you're using, a lot of folks like to have these raised off the ground, because if you have over the years, as we all know, there's enough moisture in there, even these metal cans can start breaking down and spilling and having some problems. So raising them off the ground with pallets and things like that is usually really helpful. So moving on, so rats and mice are really common. So rats and mice can get influenzas and transmit that to your birds. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is trying to understand. If you talk to poultry farmers, even conventional poultry farmers, they'll tell you they don't see ducks and geese in their barns. So the question has always been, how is the virus specifically getting in the barn? And there's a lot of different ideas and theories. Sometimes the viruses can be aerosolized, but animals like mice and rats can interface with habitat from waterfowl and then mechanically carry virus in. So there are other ways that virus can get into barns. And if we just fixate on waterfowl, then we're missing out on potentially other ways. And one thing I'll point out is if you think you don't have mice or rats, you're not looking hard enough. Everyone who grows poultry has mice and rats. And it's just our job to make sure that, again, we're reducing their potential habitat. The one thing I would point out is that understanding the difference between the two is really important. My experience is that you don't have both. You usually have one or the other. And that's really important because if you have mice, for example, their nest sites are only 10 to 30 feet from, let's say, where your pastured system is, where your coop is. And that's just really important to know, because if I can have within 10 or 30 feet of my barn or my coop, if there's no habitat for nesting, then those mice will not basically have the kind of wherewithal, if you will, to move to those locations. So that's just really important to know as far as how they move. And there are a bunch of different types of traps. I know this can be a controversial topic, and especially when you start getting into some of the rodenticides and things like that. The rodenticides work really well. There is resistance, and the other issue with rodenticides is that if you have pets, or if rodents consume the rodenticide and then die in a field, and then they get eaten by an owl, that rodenticide now affects the secondary species. And owls are really helpful as far as killing rodents and things like that. So that's kind of a double whammy as far as kind of negative after effects of rodenticides. The biggest thing you can do with respect to controlling for rodents is keeping your barn clean and reducing habitat outside of that barn. So if you go back to just this slide, this guy, if you look here, he did a nice job of keeping, basically there's no junk around this coop, right? So if you have some old tires and a little shed that's not really kept very clean, it's not on a concrete slab or something like that, or it's just not, there's overgrown grass there. That's what mice and rodents love for habitat and for nesting kind of behaviors. So traps, there's a bunch of different types of tin cats. I don't get any money from this company called Matomco, but I love their website. So if you go onto their website, you can find all kinds of different traps and rodenticides, including some that are organically approved that don't work as well. But do have, I think, more of a shorter half-life, so they don't cause some of the long-term problems that we talked about a little earlier. The tin cats work great, and you can bait them with all kinds of stuff, toxic or non-toxic. The only thing that I've noticed in general is that when you deploy the tin cats, you have to have a plan, and we can have a whole talk on where to put tin cats, how to place them, how to use traps. Mice and rats are by nature somewhat hesitant. So just putting a trap out is not good enough. It's a chess match, and it's something you just need to be aware of. And we can talk about this. And like I said, that Matomco website, and we could even get someone from Matomco or a different company if there's better resources out there to really kind of lean into this topic to best control rodents with different approaches and different philosophies. And just a few more slides. So one of the issues that I've noticed is whenever I probably get close to 100 calls a month now from around the world, kind of on all kinds of questions related to diseases and coops and their systems. And only one time when someone says they have a sick bird in their pen, have I asked them, okay, did you separate that bird and put it in quarantine in order to prevent, that disease from spreading to the rest of the flock? It hypothetically might have spread already. Or when you get new birds, making sure you quarantine those birds. Literally, like one time, if I had someone when he had some sick birds, I asked them, did you put it in a quarantine pen or a sick pen? And the answer was one time I got a yes on that. So having like a backup coop is not a bad thing. This is our kind of version of one we made several years ago. Nothing's perfect. What do you do with sick birds that are in a sick pen and they don't get better? At least if you euthanize them or you submit them to a diagnostic lab for a necropsy so you can figure out if it's treatable, now in theory, you're at least reducing the viral or the parasitic load for exposure to other animals in your coop. We talked about this personal protective equipment. I these plastic kind of booties. They're great. They're a little expensive and they're plastic, which they're single use, which is kind of a pain. These Tyveks, actually, I like these Tyveks if you reuse them. When you go to some of the bigger commercial places, they use them one at a time. But for our purposes, having some kind of dedicated clothes to me makes 100% sense. Some people will push back and they'll say, well, why am I wearing all this if the environment outside is completely open? And, this is where that, having perfect the enemy of good kind of comes in my mind. So we're not going to be perfect, but we're just trying to make sure that we're not the typhoid Mary that's spreading disease to our birds. And then this is, again, some work we've done using GoPros and things like that. It's important to know what's out there, right? So here's that barn that I showed you, that mobile coop that we had, and you can see, some wildlife that was captured there. So that's important to know. Cats are great, by the way. Cats are awesome at killing rodents. So that's the original tin cat, right? That's why we call it a tin cat, because cats basically, that's what they do. Unfortunately, FDA has kind of had a not the same opinion of cats around barns, and they want the tin cat that doesn't meow. Shade structures are also really important, not so much from a biosecurity perspective, but from a welfare perspective. If you want these birds, like Ajay was talking about earlier, if you want these birds to kind of fertigate the land as evenly as possible, you need to have not habitat, but you need to have enrichments that are around that coop, or else they're just going to stay right next to, for the most part, right next to where the feed is. So having shade structures with cloth, I'm trying to remember the name of the cloth that we put on the outside, but PVC pipe. First of all, that protects them from predators. Cloth. Shade cloth, thank you. Having shade cloth there is really good. If you make 2 or 3 of these and they're PVC pipes, so they're nice and light, you can move them around really easily. And that's a great way to have them mow down grass in whatever spot you need them to kind of start pooping and mowing down the grass a little. And then finally, I'd be remiss to talk about this. I'm an epidemiologist, so I love data. So you gotta keep track of data, whether you do it in a notebook, pen and paper, or whether you do it with a Google form. Really important stuff. This is probably one of the lowest kind of pieces of hanging fruit. We can have a whole kind of talk on this at another time, but just important. When I ask people, well, is egg production down? If they can't give me a clean answer on that, then that makes it a little more challenging to start figuring out maybe what disease we're dealing with. So there are all kinds of ways to do this, and we have some great people on the call right now, including Myrna and Faye, that can also give some discussion topics on this. And just 2 more slides, and then I think I'm done at that point. As far as waterfowl, going back to that, predator repellent tape works okay. You'll see it in some of the grape orchards in California. It's kind of blowing in the wind, and it's kind of silvery and crinkly. Works a little, not great. We experimented with just one little strand of it, so I can't tell. For what we used it for and in the way we applied it, not too efficacious, but definitely, some of the grape growers will use it. These decoys, kind of interesting that they'll scare student interns if you sneak up on them and do a good April Fool's joke on them. But predators are smart. Waterfowl are smart. If this thing's not moving, then they will flag and realize that it's not anything important. I would say walk these fence lines. I can't stress that enough. You will see gaps in them, and if there's a gap in them, then the fence, I wouldn't say it's useless. But the hardest part of the fence line is right where you're opening the gate up, where a car comes in or a tractor. So make sure you think about that space. You can have like these little curtains basically at the bottom that are made of rubber that really kind of cling to the ground. But those details matter. They really do. Like, you've got to walk these fence lines to make sure that you fill in any holes. Fill them in with gravel. Rodents, raccoons don't like digging through gravel. And then we've got these electric fences. It just gives a little jolt. They're powered by PV. And a little solar panel, and a battery. They work pretty well. They keep the birds inside for the most part, which is basically what you want. But this is the second fence. So the outer fence on a pastured system is that hard kind of fence we just showed you, and the inner fence are these electrical fences, which are easy to move around and give a little jolt to the birds if the birds kind of touch them. Nothing painful at all. Students used to torture themselves and put their fingers there for however long they could. And with that, I'll take any questions you have.